Okay, this is a big challenge, but I want to go back to Bernice Sandler, who I met so many years ago on the Hill. We came from passion in sport. This isn't just about sport, it's so much about education. And before we walked in the room, you said to me, you know, when we started on this thing, sport was like, well, if we pass this, maybe there'll be better fun days and there'll be more activities for young girls. Never imagining that, in a way, sport really provided the spotlight. It was the most controversial, but behind the scenes, in such an incredible, important way, was the opening door of educational opportunity at every level. So take us back and take us forward.
I want to tell you first that Title IX is most likely to be the most important law passed, most important legislation passed for women and girls in this century, the last century too, since we got the right to vote back in 1920. For me, Title IX starts back in 1969. I just finished my doctorate at the University of Maryland, where I have been teaching. There were 7 new openings, and when I was not considered for any of them, I went to a friend on the faculty and I said, how come I wasn't considered? And without skipping a beat, he said, well, let's face it, you come on too strong for a woman. I went home and I cried. I never should have spoken up in graduate school. I never should have said anything. I should have been more silent. And my then husband was much better on this issue than I was at the time. And he said, are there strong men in the department? And I said, weeping, yes, they're all strong men. And he said, then it's not you. It's sex discrimination. And that was kind of a new word for me, because the words in 1969, sex discrimination, were very new, and most women were simply not aware of how sex discrimination had restricted and shaped their lives. And there were no words yet, like sexist or sexism or sexual harassment or date rape. I was stunned to discover that all of the laws that dealt with discrimination at that time, none prohibited sex discrimination against women and girls in education, whether they were teachers, faculty, staff, administrators, or students. So I began to read up on how African Americans had changed the laws of our country. I read about a presidential executive order. I didn't even know what that was. It prohibited federal contractors from discriminating on the basis of race, color, religion, and national origin, and had recently been amended to cover sex discrimination. I quickly became head of the Federal Contract Compliance Committee of the Women's Equity Action League, WEO. In fact, I was the entire committee. A long story short, with very extensive but secret help from the other godfather of Title IX, unknown, he was the Assistant Director of the Office of Federal Contract Compliance, Vincent Macaluso, and in the next few months he gave me all kinds of advice, and I filed administrative charges of sex discrimination with his office against about 250 colleges and universities, and then other women's groups and organizations began filing charges also. Meanwhile, back in the House of Representatives, Representative Edith Green, a Democrat from Portland, Oregon, had been wanting to amend the laws that prohibited discrimination. My charges against universities and colleges and those that others made provided her with the constituency and the data that she needed so that she could finally introduce what eventually became Title IX. She held hearings in June 1970, and later Senator Birch Barr led the troops in the Senate, and the rest is history. It was a stealth law, since hardly anyone, including those of us working on the bill, had any idea of how extensive sex discrimination was in education. The lobbyist for the American Council on Education, which is the big organization, was asked if he wanted to testify at the hearings, and he said, no, there is no sex discrimination in higher education, and besides, it's not a problem. Had he testified, he would have analyzed the bill as we did, and he would have discovered that it would cover athletics, and it would cover higher ed and admissions and scholarships, and lots of other things. The opposition of Title IX really emerges after its passage, when people notice that it's going to cover athletics. So let me tell you what education looked like in those days. It was socially acceptable to discriminate against women and girls, and hardly anybody thought that it was wrong. I want to tell you that in one period in the 1960s, for example, there were 21,000 women applicants. In the state of Virginia, in one period during the 1960s, There were 21,000 women applicants who were rejected for admission to Virginia State colleges and universities. Would you like to guess how many men applicants were rejected?
He's got it. 0.
Not one single man was rejected, and I often wondered what happened to those 25,000 women who probably did not go to college. My application to college, like that of many colleges, stated that women needed higher grades and higher test scores for admission. The percentage of women faculty in 1969 was lower than the percentage of faculty in 1929. One woman who sent me her rejection letter for a faculty position, and it said, "Your qualifications are excellent, but we already have a woman in this department." And that was not uncommon. One woman, an assistant professor, I have to tell you, salary discrimination was rampant, and one woman who was an assistant professor who had received no promotions, no raises, because her husband taught in the department, she did not even have an office until she was awarded the Nobel Prize. Women were paid less because they were married, and also paid less because they were not married, because they didn't need as much money either. There were so few women college presidents that if it were not for the Catholic sisters who ran their own institutions, the number of women college presidents would have been less than the number of whooping cranes at that time. I'm happy to tell you that both are doing better now. Some examples from sports. University of Michigan had a $1 million budget for men's varsity sports, but 0 funding for women's varsity sports. So the women athletes had to sell apples on Saturday football games in order to pay part of the cost for their uniforms, their equipment, and for travel. There were virtually no women's athletic scholarships except at a few historically black colleges. At the University of Minnesota, for example, there was no budget for women gymnasts to pay for athletic tape to wrap their wrists, and so the men gymnasts were really very nice, would give their used, sweaty, grungy tape to the women athletes, and they would have to wash it out. In another institution, when one athletic director refused to give ice to a female athlete with a sprained ankle, he simply told her, "Put your foot in the toilet and keep flushing it." And this is an example of the kind of equality we didn't have in colleges and in universities. In K-K, discrimination was also rampant. If a science class was overcrowded, some of the girls would be forced to drop the class. Girls were openly, vigorously discouraged from having any vocational ambitions other than occupations such as teacher, librarian, secretary, and nurse. Boys would have career days, while at the same time girls had a fashion show. My own daughter wanted to take a course in auto mechanics and couldn't because the boys used bad language. They apparently had not talked to any teenage girls at the time. We are not finished yet. There is still much discrimination in education. Almost all high schools are non-compliant in terms of athletics and other issues as well. There's much to do because Title IX is more than ending discrimination. It is part of a social revolution. A revolution we didn't know we were engaging in when we started. A revolution which will have as much impact as the Industrial Revolution because it is changing the social relationships between men and women, boys and girls into more equity. And I think this is one of the biggest achievements of Title IX. It was totally unexpected for many of us, for we are helping young men and young women not only respect each other, but also to be friends. I think of my 2 grandsons, both in college, and 1 granddaughter about to enter college. All 3 have had, and still have, genuine friendships with people of the other gender. Relationships which are not sexual or romantic, but based on friendship. That would have been nearly impossible when I was a child for many students to do so. It was just something that was remarkably new, and I think is one of the direct results of Title IX. We have taken only the very first steps of what is going to be a very long journey. And our schools, our campuses, our nation, and the world will never again be the same. Thank you.
Next up, Catherine Switzer, the first woman to enter the Boston Marathon and finish. An activist by sheer passion, unknowing that what you started was going to wind up changing the landscape for women, especially in marathon running. But it took you a long time, and you lobbied very hard, and in 1984, for the first time, women ran the marathon in the Olympics, thanks to you and your efforts. Talk about your journey, Catherine.
First of all, I want to say this is a whopper every year for women. From my point of view as a runner, it's not only the passage of the Title IX Amendment, the 40th anniversary, but it's also the 40th anniversary of when women were first allowed to run on the roads. Can you imagine that? And it is also the 40th anniversary of the first ever women's road race. These all have been transformational things. And as Bernice says, this is the Title IX Education Amendment, but sports has been so highly visible and it was so impactful. So that's what I will speak from. And in fact, it was a lack of Title IX, really, Donna, that spurred me into all of this. My journey began, I have to say quickly, my journey really began when I was 12 years old. We lived in Vienna, Virginia, just down the road here. Okay, well, further down the road, but you know. And in this hot summer, I told my dad that I was going to high school in the fall, and that my school had a field hockey team. And I really wanted to make that field hockey team, but I know I could never do it. And he said, sure you can, honey. All you have to do is go out and run a mile a day, and you'll make that field hockey team. Oh, Dad, I can't run a mile a day. Sure you can, honey. You can do it. Put one foot in front of the other. I ran that mile a day. I made the field hockey team. All through high school I played field hockey. But the most important thing my dad didn't even realize is that he gave me a sense of empowerment that lasted me all my life. I had a victory under my belt every day that nobody could take away from me. And I've been running for 53 years. I still have a victory under my belt every day that nobody can take away from me when I have that daily run. Why? Because it transmorphs into everything I do in my life. It is a transformational experience. Empowerment is critically important. When I went to Syracuse University, they didn't have any sports for women. And so, feeling empowered, I'd ask if I could run on the men's track team. And the coach almost fainted. He said, it's against NCAA rules, but we'd welcome you to come work out with the team. I came and worked out with the team, and guess what? As Bernice said, this is my first experience where guys were my friends. They were so wonderful, so encouraging, so motivational. One little guy in particular was the university mailman. He'd long retired from running, but he was, because he had been an ex-runner. But when he saw me out there, he decided he could run that slowly and get back into shape, and began running with me every day and telling me about a wonderful event called the Boston Marathon. To speed up this story, he didn't believe a woman could run the distance. I proved to him in practice that I could. His promise he would take me to Boston. He did the paperwork with me. We lined up for the Boston Marathon, and 2 miles into the race, as you saw in some of the videos out in the reception area, the race director of the race, seeing a woman was in his race, lost his temper, jumped from the press bus and attacked me, and screamed at me to get the hell out of my race and give me those numbers and try to rip my bib numbers off. But luckily enough for me, my coach, who was half my size, tried to bat him away and was totally ineffectual. But my boyfriend, who was only in the Boston Marathon because if a girl could run it, he could run it. He was a 235-pound ex-All-American football player who a crossbody blocked into the official, and the official went out of the race. And my coach said, run like hell, and we finished the race. People say, oh, you were so courageous to run the Boston Marathon. I was not courageous to run the Boston Marathon. I knew I could do it. Other women had run marathons. I was not there to prove anything. I was there to run my first race. Everything changed when the official attacked me. Now, a 20-year-old girl made the decision to finish the race. That was the most important thing. The other thing that's critical for all of you who are athletes, and I see many young people out there, you will know this. You cannot run and train and work hard and stay mad. And the anger went someplace over a heartbreak hill, and I realized the man was just a product of his time, but where the hell were women? Why weren't they there? And then I suddenly thought, wait a minute, we don't have scholarships, and there are no opportunities, and the longest distance in Olympic Games is 800 meters. And I realized I was only a lucky girl. The women weren't there because they hadn't the opportunities. When I finished the race, I felt wonderful, and I wanted to create those opportunities. What I did, Donna wanted me to bring this up, this is very important. I became a better athlete, gained a lot of credibility with that. But the most important thing I did was use that journalism degree that I was getting from Syracuse University to write a lot of proposals. And I took a proposal to the world's largest cosmetics company and told them how they could be wonderful if they organized women's running because it was healthy and wonderful and helped champion women into the Olympic Games. A1 Cosmetics at the time was the world's largest cosmetics company, and they did business in many hundreds of countries around the world. And so we started this program, and eventually we organized 400 races in 27 countries for over 1 million women. And we were able to lobby those different athletic federations in each of those countries to go to the IOC and get the women's marathon event into the Olympic Games. And we talked, Bernice, about things that were as important as the right to vote. To me, when the first woman came into the Olympic Stadium, Joan Benoit Samuelson, and ran that marathon and won it, 90,000 people jumped to their feet and suddenly understood what it was all about. But what was more important is when 2.2 billion people watched it on television from tradition-bound households from Indiana to Afghanistan. Then where people are not allowed in education, are not allowed to go to their homes or drive a car. So that is what changed world thinking, and to me that was as important as giving the women the right to vote in my world, because it was the physical equivalent of an intellectual and social vote, and that this was the physical equivalent, that women could do anything.
Thank you.
So thank you. Okay, so now it's going around the world to Kenya. We're changing societies. They're inoculating kids. They're building schools with our prize money, and the world is going to be absolutely changed by this. I just came from a race with 30,000 women, and that's not a race, it's a social revolution. Okay, I'm done. Thank you. So thank you all.
So that takes me to you, Angela Kirklees. Angela, you are part of a legacy of great women's soccer players. You've helped the team win 2 gold medals, one in Athens and one in Beijing. And I'm sure you were thrilled in 1999 when, against most opinion, our women's soccer team filled Giant Stadium and the Rose Bowl and proved that women also can fill stadiums and entertain the world in incredibly creative style of play. You are a legacy of the Dream Team. So what next? Do we need a title line? Is it over?
That would be way too simple. First of all, I just want to say what an honor it is to be up here to be sitting next to the trendsetters and the pavers, being a direct recipient of Title IX. So thank you all for everything that you all have done. I really appreciate it. I grew up 7 years old first playing soccer. And at that time, I actually played with all boys. And there weren't really a whole lot of competitive girls teams to play for at that time. A lot of people in my generation, especially soccer, wound up playing with boys teams. It wasn't until junior high and high school where there were more opportunities for girls to play more competitively and in that environment. I grew up having 2 parents as college professors, so education was definitely enforced in our household. A feminist mother and father who still is one of my greatest fans. So very supported with my athletic endeavors. Unfortunately, as much work that has been done with Title IX, there still is a lot more to be done. As you mentioned earlier, internationally, Qatar, Saudi Arabia are now just allowing women to participate in the Olympic Games for the first time ever. In our country, unfortunately, softball has been a huge sport, which was just taken away from the Olympic Games. These are things that we still need to work for and to continually change to empower more women in our country and in the world. On the soccer level, we have lost 2 professional women's soccer leagues. I grew up also with a dream to one day play on the U.S. national team. 1991 was the first time I was aware of this team playing in the first ever World Cup for women. My father bought a VHS cassette tape where I watched the women play, and I said, that's so cool, you get to travel the world. So I grew up, watching these players, Mia Hamm, Julie Foudy. These were my role models, and these were women that, I wanted to play with someday. And I said that at age 12 as well. So having those goals early on and having something to aspire to, these were all things that were developed through the participation of sports. I was able to follow that dream, playing for the national team, but also to one day play professionally within soccer and to do something that I love and get paid for it. Back in 2001, we had the first ever professional soccer league in this country, the WSA. Unfortunately, within 3 years, that league folded. A couple years later, we had another professional soccer league, the WPS, in 2009. And again, 3 years later, that folded. So there's still a lot of work to be done, unfortunately. But again, we still have the hope of new teams being added, new participation from women. And I think it's really important that obviously this legislation was passed in our own country, but that we also serve as ambassadors and leaders and examples for the rest of the world as well. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you. Our next participant is Joanne Flaminio, and Joanne, we have to congratulate her there. In the 125-year history of the Boston Athletic Association, there's never been a woman elected to head the organization. I want to know, how are you leveraging the role of your organization in promoting Title IX and supporting its goals?
Well, it only took 125 What Catherine didn't tell you, the most interesting part of that story in 1967 is when she was driving back with her male counterparts after finishing the Boston Athletic Association. She stopped for an ice cream, I believe, outside of Albany on her way back to Syracuse. And she was tired and a little sweaty, but they were a little hungry. And so they went inside to get something to eat. At that time, newspapers were a very different thing than they are currently in our society, and she happened to look down and saw her face and mugshot on every single morning edition, and I think at that point she knew that possibly she was onto something that was going to influence women's sport for a long, long time. Yes, it is true that from 1895 to 1965, no women were allowed to enter the Boston Marathon, and happily in 1967, Catherine began to change all that. And finally, in 72, a couple of months before the passage of Title IX, Catherine, and with the approval of the AAU, the BAA, and with the help of my partner in crime back there, Gloria Ratty, who was with the 8 official entrants when they stood at Hopkinton in 1972 and said, "My God, we have to finish this not only for ourselves, but for all women." It was so interesting to hear all of them when they came back upon celebrating the 40th anniversary of Title IX, to hear them talk about, we stood there and we knew we were running for ourselves, but somehow along the way we knew that we were also doing something else that was terrifically important. And also how now, 40 years later, any woman who wants to run recreationally, all she has to do is click on her iPad, get out her Visa card and pay, and that they don't really understand that just a generation ago, what they were doing so easily with a click of a mouse or whatever was really an impossibility. What have we done at the Boston Athletic Association? One thing that's very important is that when we started paying purse money in 1986, we always had it equal for both men and women. We've also tried to separate out the women's start, so when Catherine's there to call the race on Patriots Day, she can give a lot of publicity and a lot of coverage and a lot of emphasis on not only who is the male winner of the Boston Marathon, but the woman winner of the Boston Marathon. We also sponsored the 2008 Women's Olympic Trials and have already announced that our 3 Olympic marathon representatives in London, and the hottest stars on the women's side, Cara Goucher, Charlene Flanagan, and Desiree Davila, will be back in Boston in 2013 to run our race. So that's just terrific. And again, we institute with everything that we do try to do, we try to have an equal purse for both men and women and try to do equal recruiting so that we pay attention to women and what they're trying to do.
As I was watching the BAA half marathon a few years back, I said, something's really interesting about this picture, Senator Bai. And that's that I kept looking, and all it was young women. And I thought, something's really going on here. Young women have really owned the half marathon in the United States. If you look across the country at who's running the half marathon, it's 60% women and 40% men. And that's true for all of the VA events except for the marathon. And you'll be very happy to know that there were 8 entrants in the Boston Marathon in 1972, and more than 10,000 women entered the 2013 Boston Marathon in Philly. So that percentage is way up to 42%. The only other point that I would make, Donna, is that this is really, other than the elites, this is really recreational running, and it's really captured the attention of women from 18 to 30. But it's obvious that from an institutional perspective, we really need to do much, much more. And so the Boston Athletic Association, for many years, has partnered with the city of Boston to have an indoor track program, to have a middle school championship, the Mayor's Cup, and we've really sort of focused in on middle school, 6th to 8th grade, because we think that that's a very sort of important age developmentally when we can really get somebody interested in an active lifestyle and get them attached to the idea of having sport as an important ingredient in their lives. And finally this year, we partnered with a female organization in celebration of our 125th year, and we've adopted an inner city school, and we're going to have a year-long program specifically looking at, again, middle school and 5th graders to have a wellness/athletic program all year long. They don't have much of a gym, they don't have much of an athlete, so we're going to go in there and spend a little money to hopefully start them on the road to wellness and athletic competition. And finally, we're all not going to grow up to be Catherine Switzer and be the best at our craft. Everything that we do when it comes to our community initiatives, our women's running, our children's programs, stresses the qualities of self-determination, self-esteem, confidence building, perseverance, the ability to start and finish, which are important ingredients not only in sport, but for success in life.
I want to go to Linda. Linda Hallman, AAUW. I saw you at the White House, and you heard us talking about sports, and I can see your frustration. But I know when you got in the room at the White House and they talked about the STEM and about education and the fact that we need to do more in those areas, that maybe you felt a little bit better after the conversation. But you've been in the forefront in a larger picture on the paycheck, on what's going on in Walmart. Can you bring us up to date?
Yeah, thank you, Donna. And indeed, I believe so strongly in the importance of the sport piece of Title IX, but don't we all know that in the early day, as Bernice said, it wasn't about sports. And it's funny, I brought today this guide, Monitoring Title IX, a guide to action for the volunteer organization, which AAUW published in 1977. We already knew there was going to be problems and issues. And so there's really little that it talks about sports. It focuses on financial assistance, course selection, physical education and athletics, counseling, and admissions. And it was basically helping the grassroots because, as we know, it was really the grassroots women who really helped make Title IX have the legs and make it happen. And I just want to read one thing and then I'll get on to the future. But this is something that it says in this guide. Generations of women in the future will be thankful that you cared enough to change the conditions and attitudes which have fostered discrimination on the basis of sex in the schools and colleges of our country. And this was a guide that AUW published in 1977. Incredible. So what's happening now? Well, I'd say that there are two major things that AUW in particular are looking at. And, you know, basically we are working to break through barriers for women and girls. And anybody who thinks that there are no more barriers left in this country for women and girls has got to go crawl under some rock somewhere. because it's certainly not the case. And one of the barriers that unfortunately exists is safety on the college campus. And part of Title IX, what Title IX can bring, is something that we can deal with campus-wide sexual assault. And I just need to tell you that the Department of Justice has found that about 28% of women are targets of attempted or completed sexual assault while they are college students. That's awful. So we need bills such as the Campus Save Act to help Title IX achieve its full reach. That bill, which AUW members regularly lobby to support, requires schools to spell out their policies, conduct prevention activities, and ensure necessary assistance for the victims. It can help end the sort of violence that truthfully prevents women from attaining their educational dreams. And I'm really pleased to say that AUW is part of that, as well as being part of trying to get the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization, which is still pending in Congress. Senator Bennett mentioned the STEM careers, and that's the other piece that I think is absolutely essential for the future and what Title IX can really help to achieve. Our country is so far behind, both in men and women, in STEM careers, and we have got to get more women involved and have an even playing field for women in STEM. That's partially because it's a much better paying field. And that's also very important for women because, as you know, everyone has to be part of an equal paying household at this point. It's a family issue. So we have got to increase the amount of women and men in STEM careers in order to help our country be more competitive in the workplace and globally across the world. So the continuing attrition that we see with women in STEM, this is an area where Title IX truly can start to speak on the educational side of where we can go. So the whole piece of Title IX, we really have got to protect it. It's one of the biggest obstacles that Title IX faces today is the erroneous belief that our battles have been fought and won. So everybody in this room today, you need to be an emissary for Title IX. This is the 40th anniversary. It'd be wonderful if we didn't have to have a Title IX, but we're not there, and we're not going to be there for a long time, so everyone has to be there and help protect Title IX. Thank you.
Thank you. Beth Brooke, as Vice Chair of a national accounting firm, Ernst & Young, you're a regular speaker on this issue. As a Purdue basketball scholarship Title IX beneficiary, how does Title IX impact the business world? What is the role of business? And what are we missing when we talk Title IX in sports?
You know, first, I have to say, when this guide, Linda, was published, 1977 was the year I got that basketball scholarship. And it's sort of surreal to know that that was going on, because you didn't know it as a kid. And it's an honor to sit between the generations. With regard to business owes Senator Bayh an enormous debt of gratitude. And I'm not even sure business realizes that. And I say that with the fact that we are filled with the products of Title IX in business. The great combination of education and sports produces female leadership that is phenomenal. I know from a personal perspective, we'll hire female athletes, female student athletes, great female student athletes, and we can teach them what they need to know about what we do, but we can't teach them what the combination of education and sports has taught them, which is leadership. And that, to me, is just a tremendous legacy of Title IX. When you look at, and I wish we could tell this story more, you look at the CEOs of today, Ellen Kuhlman at DuPont, Irene Rosenfeld at Kraft, those are great athletes. And we don't know that in many respects. But you look at most senior women in business, and you'll find student athlete in their background. And it's not a well-known and well-told story. And why? Because it has taught leadership, and they excel, and all the characteristics everybody has described. There is something, though, talk about unfinished business. There's a huge amount of unfinished business. And Senator Bai, I think it was in the video, or maybe you said it in your remarks, when you told the story about your wife, who said, Birch, don't ignore 53% of the population. There's a message in that story of a woman and a man seeing the world through a different lens. Your wife noticed that there was 53% of the population that was perhaps being overlooked. You had the great ability to objectively hear that and act on it because of your position. But the combination of the diverse perspective, I think, is what business is really starting to realize today. This is not about men versus women. This is about men and women. And the two different perspectives are desperately needed to lead effectively today. And so business is desperate for women in the pipeline and women in senior leadership. If I had to say, Donna, that is where the gap remains. I think we're at the 40 years in, we're at the end of the beginning when it comes to business, because the next step is to close the leadership gap for women. In business, certainly, in politics, certainly, but when we start to have more equal representation of women in leadership, skilled through being student athletes, we will really start to address the problems that are in the pipeline that still plague women, that still result in the numbers, Linda, of 28% subject to sexual assaults on campus. We will start to be able to deal with those issues if we have more equal representation in leadership, because they will see problems through a different lens. And again, it's not a men versus women thing. We need both perspectives. We have a different set of human experiences. We always will. And we will produce better solutions when we're leading with respecting that diversity. So that, to me, is the next chapter for business, is to close the leadership gap. Thank you.
Nina Chaudhry, National Women's Law Center. I've had the honor of reading you or working with you every year. You've been with the Law Center for 15 years. You go out and raise that money every year and fight those issues. What battles are you currently engaged in now, and how many more do we have, and how many arenas? The big question for a short time.
I'll do my best. But I first want to start by just saying thank you to all of the people in this room, you, Dr. Sandler, and especially Senator Bai and others for the legislation, because without that legislation, I wouldn't be sitting here getting to talk about the work that I love to do at the National Women's Law Center, so thank you. The National Women's Law Center is also celebrating its 40th birthday this year, and I actually turned 40 last year as well, so I like to say this to try to and we have been at the center, at the forefront of enforcing and protecting Title IX from the very beginning. Our co-president, Marcia Greenberger, was there from the very beginning, fighting the lawsuits that the NCAA brought to stop Title IX from being enforced, bringing one of the first intercollegiate athletics lawsuits against Haffer versus Temple University, I should say, back in the late 80s, and many, many more things that we've done. And we have recently launched, I just want to let everybody know, a number of anniversary materials that are on our website, including a project called Faces of Title IX in honor of the 40th anniversary, which profiles real women and girls all around the country in a variety of these areas, and they talk about their experiences relating to Title IX and not just in sports. And that's the second point I want to make real quick here, is that Title IX, of course, as has been mentioned, covers more than athletics. Certainly athletics has been one of the most controversial areas, but it's important to recognize that, of course, it's the reason most of us are in this room. It led us into schools to be lawyers, to be doctors, journalists, athletes, what have you. It also bars sexual harassment and bullying in schools, which is a huge problem that we see across the country still today for both boys and girls. It bars discrimination against pregnant and parenting students, which many people don't realize. You cannot treat pregnant and parenting students any differently than you would somebody with a temporary medical condition. You can't sort of shove them out of school because you don't like what they're, the fact that they're pregnant. You can't put them in alternative schools. You can't deny them time that they need to go to the doctor and recovery from childbirth, that kind of thing. And of course, it requires that women and girls be given equal opportunities to pursue science and technology, as Linda so eloquently spoke about. And just a couple stats on STEM that I thought might be helpful to show, certainly we've made a lot of progress, and I think we all know that, but just in terms of where we still need to go. In STEM fields, men still make up over 3/4 of the students in higher education programs in computer sciences, engineering, and technology. And so that's a case that's still playing out in the courts as we speak. And then I just want to also mention really quickly here that Title IX is still under attack in the courts. We talked about the 2002 Commission and all of the battles there that we survived, but it is regularly under attack in the courts. And we are involved in all those cases defending the law. And the interesting thing that I think people don't realize is that the premise of those attacks consistently is still that women and girls are not as interested in playing sports as men and boys are. If you read the court cases, which I know most people don't, and they can be really boring at times, but that is really the underlying premise. And so we are consistently in the courts defending Title IX even now, 40 years later.
We are, and Eleanor, you get to hit the home run. Feminist Majority Foundation, you have been a warrior in this feminist movement. What's happened to it? Is there still an embraced movement? I see this room. Oftentimes you hear young women don't self-identify with feminism. What's the future look like? And where do we have to go?
Well, the future's great, but we're going to have to continue the fight, obviously. And I wanted to finish on both a cautionary note and a call to action. As we celebrate, and I always want to thank Senator Bahai, and not only for his work on Title IX, and it wasn't just authoring the words, it's getting it through, a little detail, and his fight for the Equal Rights Amendment, because we got out in 1972. Still finish that one, right? Yeah. And we need the Equal Rights Amendment, and I'll tell you why. And this is the cautionary note. We've had to fight to keep Title IX on the books almost every year. First, we had to fight to get the regulations. I enter at that stage. I was president of Pennsylvania Now, National Organization for Women. Now fought very hard to make the regulations stronger, because they exclude some things. And one of the major things I can remember, I was very young, testifying, it excludes curriculum. A little detail, and it shouldn't exclude things like that, in my opinion. Anyway, we'll go on. It's other things. But we had an opposition. You could see it when Ronald Reagan's administration challenged Title IX in the courts. And we lose the Grove City decision, which essentially gutted Title IX. What that decision said is, you could not, the only place that Title IX covered in higher education was where you could trace the federal dollars. One of the problems with Title IX is that it prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in federally funded educational programs, period. So they came up with a brilliant idea, because this crowd was opposed to Title IX, of gutting it by saying you can't trace the dollars. And Grove City, which was a small religious school, and I'm saying this because this fight isn't over, gang. It isn't over, unfortunately. Said that it doesn't apply to us because we only get a federal guarantee on our loans. And besides the fact, you can't prove it anyway, and it's the only place, and it doesn't apply. Okay, so the Reagan administration entered court on the side of Grove City, not on the side of Title IX, and we lose the case. And my contribution here is that I was heartbroken, because I know what it's like without a Title IX. When I went to school, a lot of people say, how did I end up going to Duke University? Look what the crop was, choose from a kid that wanted to go to one of the top 20 that happened to be female at the year 1957. When I get to Duke, there was a quota. 25% of the students could be female.
And that was generous, Danny. There were schools with 10%, there were schools with 0. It didn't matter. And one of the things it did to us socially is the young women were all A students and the young men weren't, and they were bitter because we were always at the top of the class. It was not great for social relationships. So basically, I know what it was like. When I saw, and I know what was happening by 1984, the biggest triumph of Title IX was the integration of college and of the professional schools. That was the biggest deal. We all take it for granted now, but it wasn't something to take for granted, and it still isn't, my friend. We found out in 1984 that from 1984 to 88, when we restored, we were already going down in law school dramatically. Now, coming back, the fight to restore, I was now out of the presidency of NOW, National NOW, and decided to rerun in 1985 to help light the fire to restore Title IX immediately, to reverse the Grove City decision. A lot of people said, don't do it now because there was a Republican in the White House. I said, I don't care who's in the White House. We've got to do it now. We can lose a whole generation of women because they might get used to this. And so we started a fight. And I'm very proud of one of the major things the women's movement did. They were not only after Title IX, our opponents, and it was principally the Republican leadership, let's call it like it is that, in business, by the way, my friend. I hate to say that. They were not just after Title IX. There were 52 major civil rights statutes written essentially like Title IX, and they were after all of them, and we knew that. So we formed a coalition of the women's movement and the civil rights movement and the older people's movement and the disabilities movement. We were going to restore them all at the same time before they took us on one by one in the courts. And we did it, and we won it in just a few years. But that wasn't all that happened. We thought, okay, now we got the message. We might have lost in the courts, but now we solved it. Baloney. We have had to fight all of the 90s and most of this century on the same problems. Inch by inch they come back in and they introduce another regulation, and they start with sports because they thought that was the most controversial. Remember, Bush had gutted the sports thing. Mr. Obama just reversed that with the regulation. And I'm not just talking about Bush 2, by the way. There was problems with Bush 1 too. But anyway, but then, and this is very important, they passed a regulation. We corrected the sports regulation they passed that was going to injure us in sports. But, and believe me, Senator Bai came back. Remember, we had to go how many cities to fight their stupid sports commission, which was stacked, 15 people, 12 antis, 3 of ours, but we did very well. And you guys from the Women's Sports Foundation saved it. And now it's been reversed under Obama. But we still have another thing on the books. That was the regulation of 2006, passed by, and put in there by the Bush crowd, to make it easier for sex-segregated public K through 12 academic classes and schools. The Feminist Majority Foundation has spent a long time, since 2006 it seems like, it's horrible. We are now having an increase of sex segregation. That's reality. With no checking for comparability of facilities for the girls and the boys. And by the way, I'm just as anxious for boys to have equality as for girls to have equality. So there's no question about that. The women's movement wants both girls and boys to excel. But what's happening? We now have documented over 1,000 schools that are either wholly sex segregated or academic classes with what appears to be an integrated co-educational facility. And we don't really believe it's just 1,000 schools. It has been murder trying to get the data. And we just released a report in honor of the 40th anniversary. You can get it on our website. of sex segregation. There is a whole movement for sex segregation. They're talking about the pink brain and the blue brain. I mean, give me a break. And so I believe that we must fight this, and we must make sure that is rescinded. My cautionary note, if you go down here at the archives, they say the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. The price for the equality is eternal vigilance. We not only need Title IX, we need to make it stronger, we need to have regulations to make it stronger, and we need an equal rights amendment. They couldn't get away with this nonsense if we said once and for all we're equal, and we need to ratify CEDAW. We're the only modern industrialized country that has refused to ratify the United Nations Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Sex Discrimination.
Nina, what's next? How do we engage some of the young women who don't know that there are these threats? What do we do? Do we create it like we did for the Civil Rights Restoration Act when we all joined hands? How do we ignite that movement again?
Well, we certainly need to spread the word far and wide, because there are a lot of people who don't realize what Title IX encompasses, what the battles still are, and I think, as somebody said earlier, we all need to be emissaries. There's some specific things that we need to do in Congress someday, hopefully, including high school athletics, data bills. Sounds kind of boring, but what they would do basically is allow everybody in their communities to see what's going on in their schools, what's being provided for boys, what's being provided for girls. We have that at the college level, and that has led to a sea change of advocacy and people being able to say, this college I'm thinking of going to isn't offering as much athletic scholarship money to young women, and maybe I want to think about that or not go there, or advocate for something different. So we definitely have work to do in Congress. And the other thing I want to say is we need to make sure that Title IX's promise is a reality for all young women and girls, especially when you look at subgroups of women of color. We know that they're not participating, girls of color, at the same rate as young, white girls, and the opportunities, if you're in the inner city, are just not there, and it's in rural areas. So we really need to figure out how we can make the promise of the law a reality for all young women.
What I would say from my perspective is not all of us are athletes. I would just, and now that we have women on the playing fields, we need to get them in the boardrooms of major sports foundations, major sports teams, become more coaches, become more involved in administration, and having a seat at the table. By having a seat at the table, things will change.
I think we've gone beyond sports, and I think this is a social revolution, obviously, what's happened with sports. I've seen lives changed in Kenya, I've seen lives changed in Japan and Brazil, simply because of the sports experience, and because it transforms us, and it's very, very, very empowering. But I think the one thing we need to look at in terms of sports is men have had sports for 3,000 years, and women have had sports for about 100 years. So we've got a very short history, but we've got a very long future. And I think that the capabilities of women are very, very unique, and yet, and most, even physically, have yet to be discovered. I think that with men, and Beth, I agree with you on this, that we've got to go down that road together and work as a team. And I think that we can utilize each of our abilities terrifically to enhance each other, work as a team, and make this society a better place.
And I would say continuing the education for young girls and boys, as well as supporting the organizations that promote gender equality. And buy season tickets from a sports perspective. You're not going to the games.
In the United States, more than 50% of our university graduates are women. More than half of our U.S. workforce today is women. But only 17 of our 100 senators are women, only 3% of our Fortune 500 CEOs are women, and only 15% of all the boards of directors in the United States are women. You vote, you buy stock and invest in companies. All I would say is pay attention to that leadership gap, because changing it is in our hands.
what I was going to say, so I'm going to talk about bullying for a moment, because that's of great interest both at K through 12 and in colleges. And what's begun to happen is that when there is sexual bullying, sexual activity or sexual words as part of the bullying, people are ignoring it and simply calling it bullying, harassment as well.
Get out the vote. You all heard it, you heard what Ellie said, you heard what was going on, you know what Senator Bai did for us. It is up to us. There are so many millennials in this room, and I expect every single one of you to vote. Voting is a habit, folks. Just because you vote once, it doesn't mean it's a habit yet. Get out the vote. Tell your friends that it's important to vote. Men of good conscience, elect the men of good conscience. Vote for women. Get out the vote. And make sure you go up to AEW's website. We have a whole point there of "It's my vote, I will be heard." And depending on how pissed you are, you can say, "It's my vote, I will be heard. It's my vote, I will be heard." Right? You can put the inflection on the way you feel on any given day. But I'm counting on every one of you in this room to go out and recruit your friends, your colleagues.
Thank you so much for joining us on our 40th. It's just the beginning of this conversation. Thank you, Hall of Fame. Thank you, Beverly. Thank you all for joining us. I know you're all active and we're speaking to the choir, but every now and then we need to go back to the tank to get refueled, and you both certainly do that. All of you, thank you for your participation.
And thank you, Donna, for wonderful moderation of this panel.